We believe the actual evidence will show David Burke did not murder Celeste Rivas Hernandez, nor was he the cause of her death.
Right now, singer D4vd remains jailed without bail as prosecutors present their case. But this is not the trial. It is a preliminary hearing where Judge Charlaine Olmedo must decide whether the state has enough evidence to move forward. And that raises the urgent question: will D4vd's murder case even go to trial? If prosecutors cannot establish probable cause connecting David Burke to Celeste Rivas Hernandez's death, the judge could dismiss unsupported charges or narrow the case. Today, we examine the evidence, defense challenges, and legal weaknesses that could stop the case before a jury ever hears it. If you want to understand the real legal battles behind the headlines, subscribe to U.S. Crime Cases right now. Turn on all your notifications. What if the most damning piece of evidence in this entire case, the discovery of 14-year-old Celeste remains inside David Burke's registered Tesla, is legally not enough by itself to establish probable cause for first-degree murder? Wow, just think about that for a second. We are looking at a situation where a young girl's life ended in an unimaginable way. And I want to be very careful here because we are talking about a 14-year-old girl. Celeste Rivas Hernandez was just a child. She had her whole life ahead of her, and her parents, Jesus and Mercedes, are sitting right there in that Los Angeles courtroom, carrying a grief that I do not think any of us can even begin to comprehend. We have to keep her front and center as we walk through this. When you read the clinical court documents, it is so easy to lose sight of the human tragedy, but we owe it to Celeste and her family to treat this subject with absolute sincerity and respect. That is the exact legal question the defense could raise as this hearing unfolds. The stakes could not be higher. David Burke faces life without parole if convicted under the charged special circumstances, and prosecutors could potentially seek the death penalty, although the district attorney's office has not yet decided whether it will do so. Meanwhile, a public legal battle unfolding in open court could narrow or weaken the state's case before a jury is ever selected. To understand exactly how a multi-million-dollar pop star facing these horrific allegations might completely bypass a public trial, you need to understand three upcoming revelations. First, the forensic limits caused by severe decomposition, including an unknown time of death and an unidentified weapon, even though the medical examiner officially ruled the death a homicide caused by multiple penetrating injuries. Second, the difference between the earlier investigative grand jury proceedings and the public preliminary hearing now taking place after formal charges were filed. And third, the constitutional rules governing any attempt by the defense to suppress Burke's phone data, Tesla-derived activity records, or online purchase records, although no publicly reported ruling has excluded that evidence. How can a case with this much public outrage be dismissed or narrowed before reaching the trial docket? Let's look at the facts directly from Los Angeles Superior Court filings, official records, and hearing testimony. When you hear about a high-profile case like this on the news, it is so easy to assume that everything is headed straight for a jury trial. I mean, you see the mugshots, you hear the severe allegations, and you think a trial is an absolute guarantee. But that is simply not how the justice system works. The legal mechanism currently underway in Los Angeles Superior Court is a preliminary hearing. It acts exclusively as an evidentiary screening process before a judge, not a determination of ultimate guilt before a jury. Right now, Judge Olmedo is evaluating whether the state has established probable cause. If the prosecution fails to show that a public offense was committed or that there is sufficient cause to believe David Burke committed it, the judge actually possesses the authority to dismiss unsupported charges right from the bench. I see a lot of people getting confused by this part. They wonder how a judge could just toss out a murder charge when the police say they found such graphic evidence. But prosecutors must present sufficient evidence to establish probable cause that the charged felony occurred and that the defendant is responsible. This is a significantly lower standard than proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, which is strictly required at a trial. Judge Olmedo may dismiss any charge or special circumstance allegation that lacks sufficient cause based purely on the evidence presented in this specific hearing. She is not deciding whether Burke is guilty. She is simply functioning as the legal gatekeeper. Think about what that means for Celeste's parents. They are sitting in the gallery, having to listen to homicide detectives detail the gruesome discovery of their daughter's remains. It is incredibly heavy, and it is heartbreaking. But the law requires this cold, mechanical screening process to protect the constitutional rights of the accused. If the judge decides prosecutors have not established probable cause, unsupported charges can be dismissed. Legally, Burke could be discharged from custody if every charge were dismissed and no other legal hold existed. However, California law allows prosecutors to seek reinstatement of dismissed charges and may permit refiling under specific procedural circumstances. So, a dismissal at this stage does not automatically guarantee the case is permanently over, but it would completely derail the state's current timeline. To really grasp what is going on behind the scenes, we need to rewind a little bit and look at how the district attorney's office built this case. Prior to this open court hearing, prosecutors utilized investigative grand juries during the evidence gathering phase. Public reporting indicates 3 separate investigative grand juries examined parts of this case in November 2025, December 2025, and February 2026. These secret proceedings were reportedly used to compel testimony and gather evidence through subpoenas, not to secure a direct indictment. Now, why does that matter? Well, grand juries happen behind closed doors. There is no judge overseeing the evidence, no defense attorney cross-examining witnesses, and no public gallery watching the process. Sometimes prosecutors use a grand jury just to force reluctant witnesses to talk under oath. There is no verified evidence that prosecutors abandoned a failed indictment attempt or were forced to change paths due to uncooperative witnesses. Following the filing of a formal criminal complaint to which Burke pleaded not guilty, the preliminary hearing became the required open court procedure to determine if sufficient evidence exists to advance the charges. This shift from a secret grand jury to a public preliminary hearing completely changes the dynamic of the case. Unlike the closed-door grand jury proceedings, the current hearing allows defense attorneys to actively cross-examine prosecution witnesses on the record. And that is exactly what Burke's defense attorney is doing. She gets to stand up, face the LAPD detectives, and challenge every single piece of evidence they bring forward. If a detective says the cell phone data shows Burke was at the house, the defense can ask exactly who handled that data, how it was extracted, and if anyone else had access to the device. We are watching a real-time stress test of the state's evidence. Let's talk a bit more about those forensic limits I mentioned earlier, because this is where the defense could really try to dismantle the prosecution's narrative. When a body is severely decomposed, it strips away so much of the scientific certainty that prosecutors usually rely on in a murder trial. Because Celeste's remains were not discovered until September 2025, 5 months after she allegedly went missing in April, the medical examiner faced massive hurdles. They could not establish an exact time of death. They could not even identify the specific weapon used. Right. Even though the medical examiner officially ruled the death a homicide caused by multiple penetrating injuries, the defense is going to lean heavily on the lack of specifics. If the state cannot tell the judge exactly when she died or exactly what object was used, the defense can argue that there is a massive evidentiary gap in the timeline. They can ask, how do you know my client caused her death if you cannot even prove exactly when or how it happened? And then we have the digital evidence. In modern courtrooms, a murder case is not just about physical fingerprints anymore. It is about digital footprints. The state is relying heavily on data pulled from Burke's iPhone, his iCloud account, and the internal computers of his Tesla. They are also pointing to online purchase records for things like chainsaws and a body bag, allegedly bought under an alias. But here is the constitutional catch. The Fourth Amendment protects citizens from unreasonable searches and seizures. This means investigators cannot just go fishing through your phone or your car's computer without a very specific lawful warrant. The defense has the right to file a motion to suppress all of that digital data. They could argue that the police overstepped their boundaries or that the warrants lacked sufficient particularity. Like I said, no publicly reported ruling has excluded that evidence yet, so it is currently fair game. But if the defense manages to get that Tesla data or those iCloud messages thrown out later, the prosecution's case could lose its strongest pillars. The judge would essentially have to pretend she never saw that suppressed evidence when deciding on probable cause. You see, defense attorneys are not just there to argue. They are there to hold the state to the highest possible standard of the law. When they cross-examine a witness during this preliminary phase, they are looking for inconsistencies. They want to know exactly how the evidence was stored. Was the chain of custody broken? Did the detectives rush to judgment because they were dealing with a famous musician? These are the kinds of questions that introduce doubt. And while the standard right now is just probable cause, any cracks exposed in this hearing can be blown wide open if the case does eventually make it to a jury trial. I can only imagine the sheer tension inside that courtroom. On one side of the aisle, you have a 21-year-old musician who had the entire world at his fingertips. He had millions of streams, a massive fan base, and lucrative endorsements. And now he is sitting there in jail clothing, facing the very real possibility of spending the rest of his life behind bars. On the other side, you have a grieving family who just wants answers. They want to know what happened to their little girl. They want justice. And they have to sit through hours of clinical procedural arguments just hoping that the system works the way it is supposed to. If you are just joining this story and trying to make sense of the legal maze, it is crucial to remember that everything we are hearing right now from the prosecution are allegations. David Burke is presumed innocent under the law, and he has pleaded not guilty to all charges. The defense is absolutely adamant that Burke did not cause Celeste's death, but the state is pulling out all the stops, bringing in digital forensics, vehicle telemetry, and graphic crime scene photos to try and build a solid wall around him. And Judge Olmedo is sitting right in the middle, listening to both sides, preparing to make a decision that will either send a pop star to trial for his life or send the prosecutors back to square one. The physical evidence really forms the absolute center of this entire courtroom debate. And specifically, we are looking at a massive forensic contradiction between the concealment of a crime and the actual act of murder itself. According to the prosecution's official filing, Celeste Rivas Hernandez's severely decomposed remains were discovered inside the front storage compartment of a Tesla. And this was not just a random vehicle found on the street. This was a car registered directly to David Burke, sitting at a local impound yard. Wow. When you really stop and hear that, it just pauses everything. You have to take a breath and think about Celeste and the people who love her. It is such a heavy, dark reality to confront. Her parents, Jesus and Mercedes, have to sit in that courtroom gallery and listen to detectives give procedural breakdowns of how their daughter was found. I think it is so incredibly important that we do not just glaze over that detail as if it is just another piece of true crime data on a screen. We are talking about a 14-year-old girl. She was just a kid. Treating this with anything less than absolute respect would be a disservice to her memory. But from a purely legal standpoint, this grim discovery sets up a fascinating and incredibly high-stakes debate in the courtroom. Prosecutors allege that surveillance footage, when combined with other physical evidence, demonstrates that Burke was the absolute last person to drive the vehicle before departing for his music tour. They are using this to build a rigid timeline, trying to box his movements into a very specific window of time before he left the state. Right? I see exactly how the state is structuring this. The legal debate hinges entirely on whether finding the remains inside the defendant's registered vehicle is enough to legally connect him to the actual killing. To a lot of people watching from the outside, it seems like common sense. You find a victim in someone's car, you naturally assume that they put them there and are responsible for everything that happened beforehand. But the law requires so much more precision than our everyday assumptions. The discovery certainly supports strong inferences regarding the handling of the body, and it directly applies to the specific charged count of unlawful mutilation of human remains. However, ownership of a vehicle and the sheer presence of remains do not, standing alone under the law, automatically prove that the owner personally committed premeditated murder. Burke is charged with first-degree murder and unlawful mutilation, not merely being an accessory after the fact. He is not just charged with helping to hide a horrific situation. He is charged with being the person who deliberately planned and executed the killing. So, to connect Burke to the killing itself, the state has to bridge a massive evidentiary gap. They rely on a highly complex web of alleged motives and circumstantial evidence to tell the judge a cohesive story. According to prosecutors, Burke and Celeste engaged in an ongoing, illegal sexual relationship. Prosecutors allege this dynamic began when she was just 13 years old. When you hear those specific allegations, it adds this profound layer of tragedy and vulnerability to the whole situation. You think about the power imbalance between a famous adult musician and a young teenager. Prosecutors allege that Burke killed her after she threatened to expose their relationship. According to their narrative in court, this exposure would have completely jeopardized his rapidly rising music career, hitting the press right before his highly anticipated debut album release and a massive wave of tour ticket sales. The state is painting a picture of a motive rooted entirely in desperation, reputation management, and financial preservation. If you haven't subscribed to U.S. Crime Cases yet, make sure you hit that button and turn on notifications so we can keep analyzing together. To support this alleged timeline and motive, the state's filings reference a mountain of circumstantial pieces. They are not just bringing one thing to the judge. They point to alleged text messages, location data mapped out by his phone and the Tesla's internal computers, transportation records like Uber receipts, specific blood evidence, online purchases allegedly made under false names, and various surveillance footage clips. It sounds like an overwhelming amount of information when they list it all out. But remember, these remain prosecution allegations that have not been proven at trial. They are presenting this web to Judge Olmedo to say, look at the big picture. All these arrows point to one person. But then you have the defense's perspective, which changes the lens completely. Defense attorney Blair Berk has publicly stated that the actual evidence will show Burke did not murder Celeste and that he was not the cause of her death. She is not mincing words there. And during this preliminary hearing, the defense has not just been sitting back letting the state talk. They have actively cross-examined investigators extensively regarding evidence testing protocols and how the crime scene was handled. I see exactly what the defense strategy is here, and it is a classic, rigorous legal maneuver. They are looking at the exact same evidence as the state, but they are asking the judge to see the flaws, the gaps, and the assumptions in the collection process. The defense strategy aggressively highlights the severe decomposition of the remains. Because Celeste was tragically not found until months later, that severe decomposition drastically limited significant portions of the official autopsy. This is where the forensic science gets incredibly complicated for the prosecution. Because of this advanced decomposition, the exact time of death remains completely unknown. Think about how crucial that detail is for someone trying to establish an alibi. If the state cannot tell the judge exactly when the victim died, down to the day or the hour, it becomes incredibly difficult to legally prove the defendant was the only person who could have possibly been there. Furthermore, police said investigators have not identified a specific weapon. They cannot point to a specific item on an evidence table and say, this is what was used, here is the forensic tie to the injuries, and here is how it ties back to the defendant's own hands. Despite these severe forensic limitations, the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner officially classified the manner of death as homicide and determined the cause to be multiple penetrating injuries. So, if you are reading comments online saying the cause of death is a mystery, that is factually inaccurate. The medical examiner made a definitive official ruling on how she died based on the trauma they could document, even if they could not name the specific weapon or the exact day it happened. But the defense argues that making the legal leap from those documented injuries directly to David Burke is simply unsupported by direct physical evidence. They are essentially asking the court to separate the horror of the discovery from the strict legal mechanics of an alleged murder. They might implicitly acknowledge that the situation with the vehicle looks terribly damning on its face, but they will argue in court that looking terrible is not the same as proving probable cause for a premeditated first-degree killing. They want to force the state to prove the act, not just the aftermath. This brings us right back to the critical threshold of this entire hearing and why we are watching it so closely. Based on the official court filings and the hearing testimony regarding the vehicle registration and the discovery of Celeste's remains, the court must answer a very specific, narrow question. Does that evidence, when combined with the prosecution's other circumstantial evidence, actually establish probable cause for first-degree murder? Or does it primarily establish a connection between Burke, the vehicle, and the alleged handling of the remains after the fact? It is a heavy, incredibly complicated legal question. The judge has to look at the letter of the law, strip away all the public outrage, block out the media noise, and evaluate the strict evidentiary burden. It is not about whether Burke is a good person or a perfect person. The preliminary hearing is strictly about whether the state has the legal right to force him to stand trial for his life based on the specific, verifiable evidence they have managed to gather so far. If the physical link between the injuries and the defendant is missing, the judge has to decide if the circumstantial web is strong enough to hold him over. So beyond the physical remains, the prosecution's entire case relies heavily on something that is almost invisible to the naked eye. We are talking about circumstantial and digital evidence. You see, we live our entire lives on our phones and in our cars now. Every single text message you send, every turn of the steering wheel, every location you visit, it all leaves a digital trace. And in this Los Angeles courtroom, the state is pulling all of that digital history out of the shadows and placing it right in front of the judge. This includes massive amounts of communications pulled directly from David Burke's iPhone and his personal iCloud account. Prosecutors allege they are looking at location and activity data derived not just from his phone, but deeply embedded within the internal computers of his Tesla. On top of that, police said they have compiled Uber records, extensive surveillance footage from various city cameras, and online orders that were allegedly placed under completely false aliases. Wow. When you really stop and think about it, it is just overwhelming to consider the sheer volume of data being presented. It paints such a chilling picture of modern criminal investigations. While 14-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez's life was tragically and violently cut short, the digital footprints around her continued to be recorded by satellites and servers. We absolutely have to keep remembering the human cost here because it is so easy to get lost in the technical jargon. Her parents, Jesus and Mercedes, are sitting right there in that gallery. They are being forced to listen to detectives clinically talk about cell tower pings, iCloud backups, and digital aliases. They are sitting there knowing that all this sterile, cold, technical data is essentially just a map of the absolute worst days of their entire lives. It is deeply heartbreaking, and we have to approach it with that level of gravity and empathy. Celeste was just a kid. She was 14. Her family deserves to have her memory treated with absolute respect, not just as a piece of evidence in a high-profile media spectacle. We are talking about a shattered family looking for the truth, right? I see exactly how heavy that is. And this is where the strict legal mechanics of the courtroom really kick in. A trial is not just about telling a compelling story. It is about proving it according to the rules of evidence. The defense has the absolute legal right to challenge every single piece of that digital and circumstantial evidence. They can challenge the forensic testing, the evidence handling, and the chain of custody. And we are seeing that happen right now in real time. Defense attorney Blair Berk has already aggressively questioned investigators on the stand about exactly how physical items, biological samples, and digital records were collected, preserved, tested, and ultimately connected back to the defendant. If you are sitting on the defense side defending a 21-year-old whose life is on the line, You do not just passively accept a printed packet of text messages from a detective. You ask the hard questions. Who printed this? How was the phone stored in the evidence locker? Did anyone else have the password to that iCloud account? Was the evidence bag sealed properly with the right tape? However, I want to be very, very clear here so we do not create any false narratives. Currently, there is no reported judicial ruling establishing that the prosecution's evidence was contaminated, mishandled, or somehow compromised by a broken chain of custody. The defense is asking all the tough, necessary questions to cast doubt, which is their job, but the court has not thrown anything out based on contamination. And then we step into a completely separate, incredibly massive constitutional battle regarding the Fourth Amendment and California's strict suppression procedures. This is the part of the law that protects all of us from unreasonable searches and seizures by the government. If the defense wants to legally suppress those online shopping records or that highly detailed Tesla-derived telemetry data, they cannot just complain to the judge that it feels unfair. They must file a formal written motion and establish that the evidence resulted directly from an unlawful search or seizure. They have to prove to the judge that the police used an invalid warrant or that a specific search somehow exceeded its lawful boundaries. Currently, there's absolutely no verified public report showing the defense has successfully suppressed these records. There is no ruling from the bench saying the warrants utilized by detectives were unlawful. The prosecution is proceeding as if all this digital evidence is rock solid. But if a suppression motion were to be granted in the future, the affected data could be entirely excluded from a trial. The jury would never even know it existed. I think this is exactly where people watching from home get really frustrated with the justice system. They ask, if the police literally have the data showing what happened, why can't they just use it in court? But the law is there to protect everyone's constitutional rights, no matter who they are or what they are accused of doing. However, suppressing one piece of evidence does not automatically erase the entirety of the prosecution's case. If the Tesla computer data gets thrown out on a technicality, the state might still have the Uber records, the iCloud data, or the surveillance footage. The profound legal question remains hovering over the courtroom. Did the warrants establish probable cause and describe the information to be searched with sufficient particularity? Or could some evidence be excluded if investigators exceeded lawful limits? As this intense preliminary hearing starts to conclude, Judge Olmedo is sitting up there with several legal exit ramps available to her. She does not just have a simple button that says yes, go to trial, or no, everyone goes home. It is much more nuanced and fragmented than that. She possesses the legal authority to dismiss the special circumstances while allowing the basic murder charge to continue to a jury. Let me explain what that actually means, because it is crucial to understanding what David Burke is truly facing. The actual complaint filed by the state alleges first-degree murder, but it adds these incredibly heavy special circumstances. Prosecutors specifically allege murder of a witness, murder for financial gain, and lying in wait. They are claiming in court that he killed her because she was a witness to their alleged illegal relationship, that he did it for financial gain to protect his upcoming tour money and endorsements, and that he waited for the perfect, calculated moment to strike. If Judge Olmedo determines that the evidence presented in this specific hearing simply does not establish probable cause for lying in wait or for financial gain, she can strike those specific allegations right from the official record. She can look at the prosecution and say the police did not provide enough evidence to prove he did this strictly for the tour money. But she can still bind Burke over for trial on a standard murder charge. It is also procedurally possible for the judge to reduce the first-degree murder charge to a lesser offense right now. For instance, if the judge declines to hold Burke to answer on a first-degree theory due to a lack of sufficient evidence regarding premeditation, meaning the state did not prove he planned it out in advance, she may legally hold him on a lesser offense that is actually supported by the hearing's evidence. Stating that the judge simply downgrades the charge is a very misleading simplification that you see a lot on social media. The ultimate degree of murder and final guilt are ordinarily determined by a jury later, assuming the prosecution's charging theory is not permanently narrowed at this stage by the judge. And this leads us directly to the final looming question, casting a dark shadow over this entire legal ordeal. We have to talk about the possibility of a plea deal. When a defendant faces special circumstance allegations that carry the very real threat of life without parole, or potentially even the death penalty, is absolutely unimaginable. The preliminary hearing is critical because it allows the defense to thoroughly examine the absolute strength of the state's evidence under oath before a jury is ever seated. They get to see the prosecution's cards before the real trial begins. If that state evidence survives cross-examination and the case is bound over for trial by Judge Olmedo, a negotiated plea agreement becomes one possible legal mechanism to avoid a lengthy, highly public, and incredibly risky trial. Sometimes when families are grieving, a plea deal is accepted just to spare them the trauma of having to sit through a grueling public trial and relive the nightmare all over again. But we have to stick to the absolute truth here. We cannot deal in rumors or internet gossip. Currently, no plea offer or active plea negotiations have been publicly reported. Furthermore, the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office has not yet officially decided whether they will formally seek the death penalty in this case. Any claim you see online stating that Burke is quietly preparing an emergency plea deal to escape execution is pure speculation right now. While the evidence presented during this preliminary hearing will undoubtedly influence future legal strategies behind closed doors, any potential plea agreement would require formal, on-the-record approval from the prosecution, the defense, and the court. We just have to wait and see what the justice system decides as this heartbreaking case moves forward. Thank you so much for staying till the end. If you want more factual legal breakdowns of important cases, please subscribe to U.S. Crime Cases. See you next time.